Marcella flew down the forest path as fast as her legs would carry her. They ached furiously, adding to the stabs of sharp, shooting pain that had erupted in her abdomen. She finally summoned the courage to glance behind her and saw only the dark forest. Marcella slowed to a stop, hopeful that she was not being followed after all. She gasped for breath, bending over and placing her hands on her knees to rest. Suddenly, she was vomiting, throwing up fried dough and wine onto the forest floor. When her stomach expelled the last of its contents, she sighed with relief. Her legs were still trembling, but her stomach felt much better. Marcella froze as she heard the wolf's distant, blood-curdling howl. He was angry, and he was coming for revenge. I'm Vanessa Richardson. You're listening to Tales, a Parcast original. Every other Saturday, we dive into the dark origins of another fairy tale. Today we'll be recounting Uncle Wolf, an Italian tale first collected by Italo Calvino. The tales on this podcast are dark, sometimes scary, and full of adult themes. As a warning, the original story of Uncle Wolf features murder and abuse. Please exercise caution for children under 13. At Parcast, we're grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. And if you enjoy today's episode, the best way to help us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really does help. We also now have merchandise. Head to parcast.com/merch for more information. You can find all previous episodes of Tales, as well as all other Parcast originals on Spotify and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. The best-known version of today's tale was compiled by Italo Calvino, an Italian author and journalist who fought as a Nazi resistor during World War II. In the years after the war, he published a trio of failed novels, but finally found success in 1952 with the allegorical fantasy work, The Cloven Viscount. 2 years later, in 1954, Italian book publisher Giulio Einaudi hired Calvino to construct a compilation of classic Italian folk stories that he hoped would serve as an Italian counterpart to the works of the brothers Grimm. The author spent the next 2 years reading and listening to every Italian fairy tale and nursery rhyme he could find, a task made more difficult by the variety of dialects spoken in the country at the time. In 1956, he published Italian Folk Tales, a compilation of 200 stories taken from every corner of Italy. Among these was Uncle Wolf, a dark and sometimes disgusting short story that stemmed from the Romagna region of northern Italy. It is set in a small town in that area many years ago around the festivities of Carnevale, and it follows a little girl with a big appetite. Marcella sat at the back of the classroom, picking her nose and staring out the open window. The sounds and smells of the Carnevale wafted in, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in nearly 2 hours. She inhaled deeply, enjoying the scent of cured meat, fried dough, pancakes doused in sugar and cinnamon, macaroni pie, and warm ravioli. Mrs. Giolini rapped her lecture stick on the chalkboard, wrenching Marcella from her delectable fantasy. The teacher chastised her for daydreaming again, then, with a sigh, announced they would be moving on from history to something more fun, knitting flags for the school's Carnevale parade. While her classmates cheered the news, Marcella let out a groan of despair. She hated knitting. At least when Mrs. Giolini droned on about facts and figures, she could doze off. Mrs. Giolini must have sensed her apprehension, because her eyes fixed on Marcella as she delivered her next bit of news. If the students did their knitting like good little boys and girls, she would run down to the street and buy them all fratelli to eat. Marcella gasped. There was nothing more wonderful in the world than Carnevale fratelli. Just the thought of the fried, round doughnuts, piled high and covered in sugar. It got her mouth watering. Spurred on by the promise of a treat, Marcella threw herself eagerly into knitting. But within minutes she had grown frustrated with the fat, awkward needles and the tedium of the threads. Marcella glanced around at her neighbors' desks. The girl to her right already had one brightly colored flag completed and was moving on to a second. Marcella looked at her own unruly web of thread and scowled. She threw down her needles and crossed her arms. "Is something wrong, Marcella?" Mrs. Giolini had noticed right away, almost as if she'd been waiting for something like this. "Your flags aren't finished yet. Don't you want to eat fratelli with the other children?" Marcella's mind raced. The knitting was so boring, but she wanted the treats so badly. Finally striking on an idea, she unfolded her arms, replaced her scowl with the sweetest smile she could manage, and asked if she could use the bathroom. Moments later, Marcella shut the door to the dingy outhouse and plopped down on the toilet. She would hide out here until the rest of the class had finished knitting, and then rejoin them as Mrs. Giolini delivered the promised fratelli. All she had to do was wait, and she would get the desserts without any of the work. Shutting her eyes, she could almost taste the sugary doughnuts, their golden fried crust and warm, flaky center. Marcella jolted awake, startled by the sound of someone banging on the outhouse's door. She had dozed off, and now had no idea how long she'd been asleep. Marcella jumped off the toilet, yanked open the door, and hurried past the girl who had been waiting outside. Marcella reached the classroom to find the other students talking animatedly as they packed their things. She had slept straight through to the end of the school day. She read the desk, heart plummeting at the sight of an empty platter, holding only a few crumbs and grains of sugar. Mrs. Giolini saw her and smiled. "There you are, Marcella. I packed this for you so you wouldn't miss out." Marcella beamed at her teacher and accepted the paper bag. She opened it immediately, licking her lips in anticipation, then frowned. The bag held her unfinished flag and knitting needles. "You can finish it at home tonight and bring it in tomorrow," said Mrs. Giolini, picking up the plate and brushing the last crumbs into the garbage bin. Marcella sniffled loudly as she packed her things and hurried out of the school. She made her way across the town square, alive with brightly colored Carnevale decorations. As she passed the man selling fratelli, she caught a tantalizing whiff of the frying dough. Marcella burst into tears and broke into a run. The decorations became scarce as the streets grew narrow and the buildings ramshackle. By the time she reached the tiny hovel she called home, Marcella was sobbing so loudly that her mother came out of the back room to see what was the matter. Marcella wailed as she told her mother what had happened, how the rest of the class had been treated to Carnevale treats while she had gone hungry. Desperate to console her, her mother announced that she would make them fratelli herself. Marcella rubbed the tears from her eyes as her mother hurried to the kitchen. She rummaged through the nearly barren cabinets, seizing ingredients. They had a bit of flour and sugar, and even some cream that was reasonably unspoiled. There was just one problem. They were so poor that they did not own a skillet. Marcella was standing in the doorway, looking up at her mother eagerly. The woman knelt to wipe the tears from her daughter's cheeks and said, "Go to Uncle Lupo's house at the edge of the forest and ask if you can borrow his skillet. I'm going into town to buy some oil." Marcella screwed up her face in a look of concern. She had never met the old man who the townsfolk called Uncle Lupo, but she had seen the smoke rising from the far side of the forest where he was supposed to live. She knew it was a long walk, and she was already tired from running all the way home from school. For the second time that day, the promise of decadent, sugary treats inspired Marcella to action. She pulled on her boots and followed her mother out of the house. While the older woman headed toward the town square, Marcella turned down the narrow lane that led into the dark forest. Up next, Marcella meets Uncle Lupo. Now back to the story. One day near the start of Carnevale, a lazy and gluttonous little girl named Marcella became very upset after missing out on the sugary holiday treats her teacher had promised. When she arrived home from school on the verge of hysteria, her mother calmed her by saying she would make the fratelli herself. Because they were poor, Marcella's mother had sold their only skillet to Uncle Lupo, who lived on the far edge of the forest. So while she headed to the market to buy some frying oil, she sent Marcella to visit Uncle Lupo and ask if she could borrow the skillet for the evening. Marcella shivered nervously as she made her way down the narrow dirt path that ran through the forest. The gnarled, twisted trees and underbrush seemed to close in around her, as if the forest itself was going to swallow her whole. She jumped at the sound of every bird that passed overhead and every twig that snapped beneath her feet. Each shadow seemed like some large beast watching her from the periphery. She was about to give up and turn back when her stomach growled unhappily. The vision of the golden fratelli floated in her mind's eye, filling her with resolve. Soon the trees began to thin, revealing slivers of blue sky. She broke out into a run, and before she knew it, emerged from the forest into a bright field filled with vibrant orange flowers. The air was so sweet and warm, and the field so beautiful, she wondered why she had never been there before. Then, her eyes fixed on the lone structure in sight. A gray wooden cabin, tinier and even more dilapidated than her own home. Piles of garbage littered the sides of the house and the porch. Smoke billowed from the chimney, curling into dark spires that marred the otherwise spotless sky. The sight gave Marcella an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach, a feeling that was quite different from hunger. But she ignored her instincts and the handwritten sign that begged "No solicitors, please," and climbed the porch steps. Marcella knocked on the front door, then stood, waiting. For a long moment there was no response. Then a low, gravelly voice floated out of the shack. "No one has knocked on that door for years. What do you want?" Marcella called back in a loud voice,
My mother sent me to borrow your skillet so we can make carnivale fritelli.
Someone was moving around inside the cabin, knocking things over in the process. Marcella tapped her foot as she waited. When the sounds continued and the door didn't open, she knocked again, calling,
"Are you going to give it to me or not?"
The voice shot back, "Give me a minute to get my shirt on, will you?" Marcella waited for what felt like plenty of time for a person to dress themselves. When the door still didn't open, she rapped her knuckles on it a third time. The gravelly voice floated out again. "Let me get my pants on, all right?" Marcella groaned in annoyance. The man had the right to be undressed inside his own home, but she wished he would get a move on. She turned around and sat on the edge of the porch. Her eyes fell on the nearest pile of garbage, gleaming brilliant white in the sun. Marcella's eyes widened. It wasn't a pile of garbage. It was a pile of bones. Glancing around, she saw that all of the other piles she had assumed were trash actually contained bones as well. The carcasses of countless different kinds of animals picked clean of flesh and bleached by the sun. Marcella slowly stood to leave, but then the door opened. Marcella turned to face the figure who now stood in the dark doorway. He loomed above her, as tall as he was fat. An unruly mess of salt and pepper hair rose from the top of his head, and from his chin, and his feet, and his hands, and his tail. The nostrils of his wet nose flared, and his lips curled, revealing a row of sharp, white teeth. Uncle Lupo was a wolf. Marcella stared up at the wolf in stunned surprise. She was too scared to move, even when the wolf opened the door wider and stepped out onto the porch. She nearly jumped out of her skin when she saw he was holding something, but it was only the shiny black skillet which he held out to her. "Did you say your mother was making carnivale fritelli?" asked the wolf. Marcella nodded. The wolf continued, "Then you can take the frying pan, but you must return it before nightfall, full of sugar fratelli, along with a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine. Understood?" Marcella nodded meekly and took the skillet as he placed it in her hands. Then, with a swish of his tail, Uncle Lupo disappeared back inside his cabin and shut the door. Marcella looked down at the shiny black skillet and grinned. She turned and hurried down the porch, across the field and into the forest. Thoughts of Uncle Lupo disappeared from her mind, replaced by visions of the desserts that would soon be hers. Marcella's mother was already waiting for her when she reached her house. The older woman took the skillet, overjoyed to be holding it again. She filled it with oil and placed it on the stove. When it was piping hot, she dropped the round balls of dough she'd prepared into the bubbling oil. Soon a pile of golden, fried donuts were piled high on the counter. Marcella waited until the moment her mother's back was turned, then grabbed one off the top and stuffed it into her mouth. She yelped in pain and spat the searing hot pastry out onto the floor. The molten pastry had burnt her tongue and the roof of her mouth. Marcella began to cry, while her mother scolded her for not being more patient. Then she made the girl sit at the table and wait until the treats had cooled. Finally, it was time. Marcella stopped crying the instant her mother placed the plate of sugar-coated Fratelli in front of her. The girl stuffed the first donut into her mouth, and her eyes widened in supreme delight. They were the most delicious things she had ever tasted. She popped another Fratelli in her mouth, and then another, and another. Soon the plate was empty. Marcella looked around eagerly and spotted the rest of the donuts sitting on the counter. She hurried over to them and was about to pile a handful onto her plate when her mother stopped her. "You've had quite enough, young lady. The rest are for Uncle Lupo. Now be a good girl and bring him back his frying pan." Marcella's mother placed the skillet and the plate of Fratelli inside a wicker basket, along with the loaf of bread and the bottle of wine he had requested. Then she handed the basket back to Marcella and told her to be on her way. The forest wasn't nearly as frightening the second time around, but the path seemed twice as long. Without the promise of a reward, Marcella found herself dragging her feet. Her legs were getting tired, and her arms ached from carrying the heavy wicker basket. If only it were a little lighter. Marcella opened the lid and peered in at the golden donuts. There were so many of them. Uncle Lupo would never notice if one was missing. She reached inside and popped one of the donuts into her mouth. She let out a sigh of pleasure. The sweet, flaky pastry was even better than she remembered. But the moment after she swallowed, the pleasure began to fade, replaced by an urgent craving, even stronger than before. "Just one more," Marcella thought, reaching for another Fratelli. Marcella continued down the path, occasionally reaching into the basket for another of the delicious treats. "Just one more," she thought as she took another and another and another, until she reached into the basket and found there was nothing left to grab. Marcella stared at the empty plate, chewing her lip and wondering what to do. Uncle Lupo would not be happy. Perhaps she could run into town and buy some from the man in the square, but she had no money, and it was already getting dark. Then Marcella's eyes fell on the loaf of bread. Thinking quickly, Marcella broke the bread in half. She started tearing one of the halves into smaller pieces, which she then rolled into balls. Soon she had a small pile that looked reasonably similar to the Fratelli. But would they taste convincing? She bit off a piece of one of the bread balls and chewed slowly. They didn't hold a candle to the real Fratelli, but they weren't bad. Besides, she thought, Uncle Lupo was a wolf. He'd probably scarf the bread down so quickly he wouldn't even get the chance to taste it. Marcella continued on her way, congratulating herself for her cleverness. She ate another bread ball as a reward. The only problem, she thought as she chewed, was that they were a bit dry. She really needed something to wash them down with. Then Marcella remembered the bottle of wine. Uncle Lupo wouldn't notice if she took a sip. So she did. And then she had another bread ball, and then another sip. All this walking was making her very parched, she thought, taking yet another gulp of the wine. Soon her head was swimming, so she sat down against a tree to rest for a moment. She popped another bread ball into her mouth and chased it with a swallow of wine. Then she shut her eyes and waited for everything to stop spinning. A short while later, Marcella was awakened by something warm and wet on her face. She opened her eyes and was greeted by a massive pink tongue and gray nose. She scrambled back in surprise from the donkey, which had been eagerly licking the sugar and crumbs from her face. It was lashed to a small cart, loaded high with limestone.
"Knock it off, Penelope!"
The old stonemason ran forward, dragging the donkey off of Marcella. He apologized fervently, but was quite interested to know what a little girl was doing alone in the middle of the woods with an empty bottle of wine in her lap.
"Empty?"
Marcella's eyes widened as she turned the bottle upside down. She had drank every last drop. She opened the basket and gasped. The bread had gone the same way as the Fratelli. Panicking, Marcella turned to the stonemason and begged him to give her one of the limestones packed in the back of his cart. The stonemason seemed quite confused at what she would want with just a single stone, but he handed it over. He asked again if Marcella was all right, but she ignored him. He shrugged and continued on his way. Marcella examined the limestone brick. It looked somewhat like a loaf of bread, she thought. Perhaps Uncle Lupo wouldn't notice right away. It would at least give her time to go home and get a fresh loaf from her mother. But there was still the problem of the Fratelli. Looking around, Marcella's eyes landed on a pile of donkey dung lying in the road. She knelt beside it and, pinching her nose with one hand, used the other to scoop up the dung. Just as she had done with the bread, she rolled the droppings into small, round balls, which she stacked on the plate and placed inside the basket. That just left the wine. Marcella wandered off the path a bit and soon found a small ditch full of muddy brown water. She filled the bottle with it and pushed the cork firmly back into place. Then she added it into the basket and went sprinting down the path. Up next, Marcella delivers her gift. Now back to the story. It was almost dark when Marcella neared the end of the forest. Her shoulders and arms ached from carrying the wicker basket, which held the skillet that Uncle Lupo had lent her. In exchange, he had requested Fratelli pastries, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of wine. Her mother had given her all three to bring him, but along the way, Marcella had gotten hungry. Just one more had become 2, and then 3. Soon she had eaten all the Fratelli and bread, and drunk all the wine. Thinking very quickly, or perhaps not at all, Marcella had replaced the loaf of bread with a brick of limestone. The Fratelli she replaced with balls of donkey dung, and the wine, muddy ditch water. None were particularly ideal, but they were the best she had at the moment. When Marcella emerged from the forest, the sun was beginning to set, painting the field in brilliant pinks and oranges. Gray smoke billowed from Uncle Lupo's chimney once again, fogging over the sunset colors in the sky. Marcella tiptoed onto the porch, gingerly placing the basket on the steps. She preferred to be long gone when Uncle Lupo found the basket. Perhaps he would believe that someone else had come along and stolen the contents, replacing them with the stone, dung, and mud. She had just turned to go when the door creaked open. Uncle Lupo stepped out onto the porch, glowering at her. "You're nearly late," he growled. "I'm very hungry. Give me that." Uncle Lupo snatched the basket away from Marcella. The little girl watched in horror as he reached inside and drew out the plate. Then he opened his jaws wide and poured the entire plate of donkey dung inside. Uncle Lupo's eyes shot open. He retched, spitting out the dung he had not yet swallowed, and vomited the rest onto the porch. He snarled, still gagging. Desperate to wash the nauseating taste from his mouth, he grabbed the bottle, pried out the cork, and began to pour the contents into his mouth. A moment later, he spat the mouthful out. Now even more desperate, he grabbed the brick of limestone and shoved it into his mouth. There was a loud crack, and Uncle Lupo screeched in pain. He spat out the stone along with several of his teeth. The wolf howled in anger. He turned to where Marcella had been standing only a moment before. The girl was gone. Looking up, he saw a small shape racing off into the forest. His nostrils flared, eyes sparkling with raw fury. He had to wash this foul taste from his mouth once and for all. Nothing would do the trick better than the blood of a little girl. Uncle Lupo craned his neck and unleashed a blood-curdling howl. Across the forest, Marcella came flying into her house, tears streaming down her face for the second time that day. Her mother looked up at the slamming door and asked, "What is the matter now, my daughter?" As Marcella confessed what she had done, her mother's face fell. "I made you an entire plate of fratelli before you left. Was that not enough?" Marcella wailed on the verge of hysteria.
He's going to come and eat me! I know it!
Her mother shook her head, jaw set in determination. "No, he isn't. Come on, we don't have much time." Marcella raced around the house, shutting and locking all the doors and windows. Her mother followed close behind with a stack of boards and fat, thick nails, which she hammered in place over each entrance. Last, they turned over the kitchen table and used it to barricade the front doorway. They were just checking that the last window was secure when they heard the sound of padded footsteps outside, accompanied by Uncle Lupo's heavy panting. Marcella and her mother stood against the far wall, clutching each other in terror and watching the front door. They heard the doorknob rattle, but the barricade didn't budge. The low, rumbling growl sounded outside. "That wasn't very nice, little girl. You promised me delicious treats." Marcella and her mother didn't move or respond. They listened in still silence as Uncle Lupo walked around the perimeter of the house, testing each of the windows. After he had tried every one, the sound of heavy panting and the padded footsteps faded away. Perhaps he had given up. Then she heard a loud clatter from above. Was he trying to climb in through the chimney? Marcella's mother flew forward, grabbing the boards and nails. "Hide under the covers!" she shouted at her daughter, and began to nail the boards over the fireplace as quickly as she could. The wolf's growls grew louder. Marcella peeked out of the covers. Her mother had finished placing the first board, but there was still a large gap in the fireplace. She reached for another board. Marcella's mother hammered in the first nail, then the second, the third. Marcella jumped as something crashed to the floor inside the chimney. As Marcella's mother swung the hammer at another nail, the boards covering the fireplace exploded, shooting splinters into her face and neck. Marcella's mother screamed in pain. Uncle Lupo tore into the room, bowling her aside in an instant. Marcella cowered in fear on the bed. The wolf stretched to full height in front of her, his lips pulled back in a hungry snarl. He was most certainly going to eat her. The wolf grabbed Marcella's leg just as her mother came running up from behind with her clawed hammer held high above her head. She swung for the wolf's skull. Uncle Lupo swatted his paw and sent Marcella's mother flying across the room. Marcella watched her mother's body crumple against the wall, unconscious. Uncle Lupo kept his hungry eyes on Marcella the entire time. Then he lifted her into the air. Marcella flailed, helpless. She screamed as she disappeared down the wolf's gullet, clothes and all. Uncle Lupo licked his lips and belched. He patted his stomach, suddenly feeling very full. As he turned to go, he saw Marcella's mother picking herself up off the floor, still in a daze. "Maybe just one more," said the wolf. Italo Calvino described the story of Uncle Wolf as a simple folktale for children and an early precursor of Little Red Riding Hood. Far from begrudging the story its simplicity, Calvino delighted in what he described as its rudimentary elements of gluttony and excrement and its progression of fear. Calvino's decision to set his version of the tale during the feast of Carnevale is no accident. The Italian equivalent of Mardi Gras, this holiday is enjoyed by Christians as an opportunity to indulge ahead of the season of Lent. Clearly, the story's protagonist is no stranger to indulgence, a fact that Calvino emphasizes by frequently referring to her as the little glutton. As with many folk tales of its type, Uncle Wolf offers a moral lesson that is as straightforward and simple as the story itself. It comes as a warning that rings loud and clear: be a little glutton, and you'll get your just desserts. Thanks for listening to Tales. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. You can find all previous episodes of Tales, as well as all other Parcast originals on Spotify